Okay, today we are going to talk about the infamous adrenal glands. The adrenal glands that everybody seems to think they understand, but are usually generally much more complex than maybe presented in the alternative field or even on the internet. And we do a lot of work with the adrenal glands. And so we'd like to do the adrenal fatigue factor, the facts explained. I am Dr. Rutherford. I am a certified functional medicine practitioner. I am a chiropractor since 1979. And this is Dr. Gates.
Board certified chiropractic neurologist, as well as being a chiropractor.
We have married our two disciplines and have kind of inadvertently, if you will, developed a chronic pain practice that has a heavy leaning towards neurological problems, autoimmune problems, and to address those, we have to have a lot of conversance with things like the thyroid, as most of you know, watched us, the gut. But the adrenal glands are a significant part of creating several of the conditions that we treat. And I would say even as much, if not more so, they are a significant perpetuating factor in a lot of the conditions. So a lot of folks will go to a nutritionist, they'll get some advice, they'll feel good. Then 6 weeks later or 3 months later, they won't feel good. They may not understand why. And it may be these infamous adrenals that are sabotaging the long-term effect. And I think we might talk a little bit about that. Dr. Gates is the one who chooses the vast majority of these topics. I give him lists of topics to do, but he never does them.
That is not true. My first list in about 1.5 years. We just got one.
I've given you a list. A year and a half ago.
1.5 years ago. Yeah. We
So,
exhausted those options.
But these topics come from what we hear regularly. And as we were discussing this morning, the reason that he chose this topic is we're getting a lot of, for some reason lately, Dr. Gates, this is getting past me to you, Dr. Gates is getting some feedback from the medical community that they don't believe in adrenal fatigue. My question to Dr. Gates was, well, what do they believe in? I won't tell you what his answer was. So we're going to tell you what we've seen. And again, for those of you who may be new to us, or even those of you who watch, we don't give you any data that we have not seen and produce either a positive or negative result in clinical practice. We see a lot of patients. So if we get a piece of data and we try to fine tune our procedures by adding it to 25 or 30 cases and we see spectacular results, we're not going to wait 5 or 10 years until the research says that that works. Controvertibly, if we see not so good results or no results, it doesn't usually take us that long to understand that that's probably not going to be a part of our protocols, and that we're probably going to see research in the next 5 or 10 years that tell us that it doesn't work. I mean, this is how you find out what works and what doesn't work. So let's talk about adrenal fatigue. The most people who come in for a consult understand that the adrenals are our stress glands. So the adrenals are massively more involved in our physiology than that. But let's go with the stress response. And it's just a huge part of chronic pain. So why don't you go ahead and do your thing?
Well,
we'll start with the stress response.
I think it's been months since we mentioned our favorite author, Dr. Robert Sapolsky. He wrote a fantastic book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Anybody watching this broadcast, it is a must read. You have to watch it. He was also profiled on National Geographic. The title of the documentary was Stress, Portrait of a Killer. And it was just a wonderful demonstration of what stress can do to human being and really other mammals that he was studying. So with stress is a response that we have. It's meant to last for about 20 minutes, not much longer. Think of you running away from a lion, or think of you fighting a mountain lion out in the wilderness. That's what a stress response is designed to do, or that's really its purpose. What it's designed to do is in essence, allow your muscles to contract as hard as humanly possible. You've heard of the stories of the grandma who lifts the car off the child. Those things are real because the stress response can facilitate quote unquote superhuman events and feats, so to speak. Also, the stress response is designed for us to get sugar to our muscles. It's designed for us to get blood flow to our muscles. And it's also designed for us to dilate our pupils so we get more light into the retina so we can see more things. We shut off digestion when we're under stress because who wants to be digesting your hamburger when you're running from the lion? These are all classic examples. So the stress response is a very beneficial physiologic phenomena. However, in today's modern society,
it's a survival mechanism.
It's a survival mechanism. Unfortunately, in today's modern society, people are under chronic stress. People are under stress demands that probably are not physiologic or what we're meant to be under. A lot of people are subjected to horrific stresses in childhood. We're going to talk about that, and that can really affect their stress responses throughout the rest of their lives. We've talked about that relative to fibromyalgia, and we'll go into it today. But these chronic sustained stress responses are deleterious or negative for our health in many, many ways, because we've seen that they can shift the immune response, such that when you have cortisol, that's a stress hormone, we'll go into it, that's high for a long period of time, that can result in your immune system kind of becoming imbalanced. Think of the Marine Corps and the Air Force being imbalanced when we're attacking an invader. And so that can lead to the immune system attacking us. Also, we know with cortisol being elevated for long periods of time, the gastrointestinal tract can start to break down and large molecules can filter into the bloodstream, and that can be associated with a host of problems that we've talked about, commonly referred to as leaky gut syndrome, autoimmune disease, diabetes, so on and so forth. So I guess I could keep going on and on, but the point is that we have a stress response. It should be good, but in today's society in America and several other societies, the stress response is chronic and it's not tempered. It's not augmented, so to speak, to the right degree. And because of that, we see a lot of physiologic problems. And today's broadcast will also go through, for those of you out there suffering with fatigue, how the stress response is not the only thing. And the adrenals are not the only target, so to speak. So, yeah.
I get a lot of folks. I had one just yesterday says, why are so many people getting sick? And Doug Gates talks about fatigue in our society. I don't even think I don't think we had the term stress relative to what we're talking about until like the 50s or 60s. So although stresses have always been there, with the evolution of society, with the evolution of technology, with the increasing complexity in our society, I'm 63 years old, and I've had to go through those of us in my age group and older have seen multiple rapid responses. This may seem unrelated, but I remember when the stock market used to move like 15 points in a year. And now the stock market moves 15 points in a nanosecond. It moves 1,000 points in a nanosecond. It's a little stressful to the people in the stock market, but I just use it as representative of the changes, the computer changes. I'm not very computer conversant because I haven't had to be up until this point in time. I have numerous people around me. I can just say, hey, listen, I need this, and I have it. But next year, that's on top of my list because it's now becoming important that I do that. That's a little stressful. There are other things. There are the chemicals. There are the antibiotics. We have a societal issue going down, but these are things that seem to contribute to chronic pain. Yes, the food and things of that nature, but the stress seems to be, and we're talking chronic stress. And I think, and I don't mean to correct you, and I never do this, but I think I'm doing it for these folks. I think they even say, I think even Sapolsky, I think he says in his book that it can be okay up to 3 months. And then he says, once you get past 3 months, it's like your history. If you've been stressed for more than 3 months, it's damage city for basically, man, everything in your body, just about, because the stress hormones can affect so many things. So all of the things, the modified foods, the new foods, the stress, and the people coming in here on 20 drugs, the too many antibiotics, and on and environmental issues, and the heavy metals, and all of this type of things that we're exposed to. I would put this up in maybe the top category of what's going on as far as at least triggering the bad chemistry as well as ultimately perpetuating it. Now, people generally understand that stress isn't a good thing. By the time Dr. Gates and I are done, you're going to understand what that really, really means. So, adrenal fatigue, is that where you want to go? You feel like you got through the purpose of the adrenal glands there?
I think so.
Okay.
Well, I was discussing with the patient yesterday some of her symptoms, and she had talked to her endocrinologist about her symptoms and asked the endocrinologist, well, do I potentially have adrenal fatigue? And the endocrinologist's response was that, one of these endocrinology societies does not acknowledge adrenal fatigue in our society as being a medical diagnosis. And I've seen this reference from other endocrinology societies too. And
That's
other
why they're
endocrinologists
scholars and not clinicians.
Yeah. No comment. But it's very interesting because we have this huge population of people who are massively stressed out, not sleeping enough, waking up fatigued. If you look at the market out there in terms of coffee, oh my gosh, how many billions of dollars are involved in coffee? And most people have to have their coffee because they can't wake up without it.
Cross and say first thing in the morning, you see all the guys at
Starbucks.
At Starbucks, they got adrenal.
Absolutely.
They got adrenal fatigue. In the afternoon, they have blood sugar problems.
Exactly. Then they
all the lineups over there at the coffee Starbucks.
And advertisements for 5-hour energy and Monster energy drinks. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, because likely the pace that many of us are trying to maintain it's just not feasible.
What stresses out the adrenal glands?
Well, many things.
Everything.
Yeah.
Everything. Chemistry stresses it out. Lack of sleep stresses it out. The adrenal glands cause lack of sleep. So now you got a vicious cycle there. You got infections. You got everything. One of the things I find that people don't understand is that the adrenal glands aren't just mind stress glands.
Right. Blood sugar being one of the biggest. No, that's fantastic.
That.
Blood sugar is one of the biggest stressors to the adrenal glands. So those of you who wake up and you have your coffee and you don't feel like having breakfast, and then you don't eat till noon, or you skip at lunch and you wait till dinner, your adrenal glands, one of the principal purposes, as I kind of referenced before, is that the adrenal glands sustain blood sugar. So we have adrenal glands largely either to fight the lion or for us to go out into the desert and fast for 30 days. I mean, I have some patients, they can't not eat for 4 hours without becoming hypoglycemic, shaking hands, can't think, can't talk. So the adrenal glands are there to sustain blood sugar. So when people don't eat frequently enough, that's very, very hard on the adrenals. In addition to the other things that Dr. Rutherford mentioned, from infections to psychological stress to history of abuse to pain, can be hard on the adrenal glands, so on and so forth. So in terms of adrenal fatigue not being a medically acknowledged diagnosis, that's one point we wanted to hit, because one of the emphases that we're going to use with this broadcast is that adrenal fatigue is well referenced in the literature. There are many studies. There's a plethora of studies that are basically demonstrating abnormal stress responses from the adrenal glands, so abnormal production of hormones from the adrenal glands being observed in a variety of conditions, from chronic fatigue to fibromyalgia to those who have been subjected to abuse. And we'll talk about all that and what it means to you as the patient. But also, as Dr. Rutherford mentioned, many people watching this broadcast are watching because you're fatigued. And if you're fatigued, you have to realize that there are many other variables that can be involved too, from your thyroid gland having subclinical hypothyroidism, so your doctor tells you you're normal, but really you're not normal. You're in the gray area, so to speak. Or maybe you have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, where your immune system kills your thyroid. Perhaps you have chronic infections in your body that are depleting your energy producing parts of your cells, termed the mitochondria. Maybe you have bacterial overgrowth in your intestines and pieces of bacteria breaking off, going into your bloodstream, and that's resulting in you being fatigued. We had a great case of that this year. She'd been treated for everything. We fixed her gut in 2 weeks. Her chronic fatigue that she'd had for like a decade was gone. And then other cases include autoimmune disturbances that haven't been diagnosed, to insulin resistance. So those of you who go out and you enjoy your big lunch and all of a sudden you're fatigued in the afternoon, or you're just fatigued after meals, your carbohydrates may be an issue.
Yeah, in the functional world, you come in here with fatigue and right away our brains go to abnormal thyroid that's either been misdiagnosed or diagnosed and it's not being managed well. It goes to blood sugar, it goes to stress, more adrenal issues. I say stress, but adrenal issues, and it goes to gut problems. And then how many things are there involved with taking care of those? Like 100.
Right. A lot of variables.
Maybe, a lot of things like that. So as Dr. Gates said, fatigue is not the issue. And the other thing that Dr. Gates wanted to clear up was there are a lot of doctors saying, well, we don't believe in it's not acknowledged or whatever it is. And the other thing is that people come in here and they just think it's just, they've gone to their alternative practitioners. And for years, I must say, probably around here since the 1980s. I mean, we're in Reno, Nevada. Let me tell you, this was like the mecca for alternative work back in the 70s and 80s. It was the first place that in America that you could use Laetrile. Kind of went along with Reno being like the Wild West and the divorce capital of the world and Mustang Ranch and all these other things that we had out there. Was not quite what we really, gambling, the whole thing. But it kind of led into this Wild West thing of where there was a lot of alternative stuff going on here, and it was good things. And most, even back then, the doctors acknowledged thyroid and adrenals were like the key to so many of the stuff, but pretty much it was an adrenal stimulant or a thyroid stimulant. And so we're still trying to get past that with a lot of the patients. A lot of people come in, well, I'm taking this and that. And one thing that I think is important to know about the adrenal gland, as well as your liver, not that that's the bit, but these glands are extremely capable of regenerating if you take the stresses off of them. But again, stress comes in many, 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 many forms, not just the stress of I had a post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is serious enough, but or I'm just nervous, or I just have anxiety or things like that. It's not just the mental stress, it's the chemical stresses. Your adrenal glands, you could argue, are your balance glands. That when people from ancient history say we want to create balance in the system, we want to create homeostasis. Well, you create homeostasis in a system, guess what? A person's probably going to be healthy. They're probably going to, whatever they have is probably going to get better. Well, the adrenal glands are like almost like the central figure in that statement and in that clinical application. So okay, so we're going to talk about further. They say that it's not medically acknowledged in the diagnosis. You just explained why.
And one thing I want to hit one more point on that. You as a patient have to understand how doctors and really scientists look at these problems. Many times they're trying to say, okay, one thing causes one problem and we can give one medication to correct this, or maybe a couple different medications to correct this problem. Now we have a disease entity. Whereas with, let's say with adrenal fatigue, the reason why it's not a medically acknowledged diagnosis is because it's multifactorial. Just as we said, it could be your thyroid is why you're fatigued. And these are things that may not even be in the purview of these researchers. They just know that there are other things going on that are confounding their results. So there may be thyroid problems, blood sugar problems, bacterial overgrowth in the gut, on top of adrenal problems, on top of the fact that the adrenals will respond differently, whether you're in that acute phase of stress the first 3 months, or if you've been stressed out since you were 5 years old because you were abused. So there's a spectrum, and you have to look at each adrenal case individually in the context of everything. Whereas they're just trying to say, okay, we can't just say all these people are fatigued and all of them have so much cortisol and we can give them cortisol replacement. Oh my gosh, now we have a medical diagnosis of adrenal fatigue. So I just want to hammer that point home.
Yeah, it's the reason I think is one of the big reasons why research on human beings for nutritional aspects or gut aspects or things of conditions like that is inconsistent. You could argue unreliable in a lot of different cases, simply because they never take into consideration that the person that they're working with might be stressed. They don't believe in adrenal fatigue, so they don't take it into consideration. You have a person flooding their system with stress hormones. They're studying the gut. The stress hormones are flooding the gut, damaging the inside of the gut. They're trying to use herbs, they're trying to use drugs, they're trying to use these types of things. They get some temporary results, and maybe they say, oh, that doesn't work because it worked for 6 weeks and then it stopped working. Whereas it wasn't that herb didn't work, it was that the system was being flooded with adrenal hormones and it wasn't even being taken into consideration in the research. So for those who bring these research papers into me and stick them in my face, you have to understand there's a lot more going on than what you're reading. And for those of you who do a lot of your own research and you're frustrated, this is one of the reasons why, because you really have to have the understanding of all 9 systems of the body to be able to evaluate that one research paper in your hand that may evaluate one biochemical pathway of one of the 9 systems in the body without taking the others into consideration. And this adrenal gland, I think, is the biggest factor in contributing to the inconsistent results that a lot of this research gets. do this, then the next year don't do this.
Mhm.
Do this, then the next year don't do this. So let's talk about the evidence based on what we're talking about.
And I feel very good with the articles that we attached to today's broadcast. They're pretty strong. And as always, it's just a matter of time. You can dig through the PubMed database and find gazillions of articles, and there can be disparate information. But again, you have to be able to kind of have the ability to assess the research and what it actually means clinically for patients. Relative to fibromyalgia, the general overview on fibromyalgia and the adrenal glands is that we know that a lot of fibromyalgia patients have been through episodes of PTSD. It's rather high. Estimates vary. Some say 20%, others say 30%. We think it's higher. Most of that PTSD relates to childhood abuse. But we see people all the time where maybe they have an ailing mother who has dementia or something of that nature, and that's caused them to be under stress. Nonetheless, with fibromyalgia, there's a tendency for the adrenal glands to be fatigued such that they don't make enough cortisol throughout the day as compared to average people, let's say, without fibromyalgia. And one of the interesting facets with fibromyalgia is that when they inject a fibromyalgia patient with the hormone that comes from the brain, specifically the pituitary gland that tells the adrenal glands to make cortisol, that when that hormone is injected into a fibromyalgia patient, the adrenal glands don't respond. They're just like flatlined. So they won't even make more cortisol because of that. So it's a curious response, and they haven't quite been able to explain it, except that the adrenals are kind of offline and they're kind of doing their own thing in fibromyalgia patients. Have we found the adrenals to be an important piece to the puzzle for fibromyalgia patients? Yes.
Huge.
Usually we address it later on in the treatment protocol, but yes, it can be very important.
Yeah. Yeah, we see that. We see that in pretty much every case. I mean, two of the things we see in every fibromyalgia patient is an autoimmune component and this adrenal-related stress response. In every single fibromyalgia patient, we see some aspect of one or both of those. No, probably both.
Yeah, and as we tied into another broadcast, also one thing they see with fibromyalgia patients is that they have a tendency for their cortisol to go up at night too, which correlates with their insomnia, inability to sleep. And when you can't sleep with fibromyalgia, you can't get out of the pain.
Yeah, and you get like you sleep experts out there, you kind of have to get into that deep REM sleep for your tissues to really start to heal. And so it's like a total sabotage of anything that's even trying to fix you in the middle of the night. Chronic fatigue, it's interesting. Two things that everybody comes in here with is depression and chronic fatigue. Almost nobody comes in here for depression or chronic fatigue.
Right.
They might come in here for weight loss
Mm-hmm.
and be fatigued, and they figure it's because they're overweight
Right.
and all that, and that's a part of it, okay, but it's generally only a small part of it. People come in here for fibromyalgia, they're fatigued. In fact, that was the first time I became most aware of chronic fatigue. When I first started getting into this, most of the patients I started seeing in the beginning were fibromyalgia patients, and they were chronic fatigue. And the background on that, why that struck me so much, was we're in Reno. The gentleman who developed the theory of chronic fatigue is from a place called Incline Village, Nevada. They call it Income Village, Nevada right now, because a lot of billionaires live there. And he developed the Epstein-Barr theory of chronic fatigue, which has been kind of discounted since then, at least as the total reason to get chronic fatigue. And it started to strike me, all these people had chronic fatigue. Well, we were treating chronic fatigue, and as these people were getting better, their chronic fatigue was going away. So again, I briefly went over chronic fatigue and the 4 components. Why don't you go into it a little bit more thoroughly?
Yeah. With chronic fatigue, and what we see with the cortisol profiles is that they tend to be blunted compared to average control. So there tends to be less cortisol produced in the chronic fatigue population. But as Dr. Rutherford was saying, with this chronic fatigue group, and lots of times they have poor intolerance to exercise, or they have poor intolerance to just kind of getting through their daily activities, they'll just be crashed for a few days. Again, it's multifactorial. I can't emphasize this issue of subclinical endotoxemia enough in this population, where pieces of bacteria from the intestines can break off going into the bloodstream. That is a major generator of fatigue for these patients. However, lots of times within this umbrella, the Lyme disease patients are included, such that they see an alternative practitioner and says, oh, you have Lyme disease based on my classification. Oh, and you have these 10 other co-infections. And we don't necessarily dispute that, But the route at which they're treated, lots of times it's with heavy duty antibiotics where they have a PICC line inserted or a port. They may be on antibiotics for 3 years for Lyme and these other co-infections. Sometimes it works for sure. And we've seen a lot of other cases where it doesn't seem to work. And when it doesn't seem to work, it's just you're killing off these infections, but the ramifications systemically of just taking antibiotics for 3 years can be pretty profound from your intestinal microflora, as most of you know, becomes dysregulated. You can get yeast and bacterial overgrowth, the wrong type, so to speak. And all these other, again, pieces of the physiologic web of dysfunction are not being addressed.
And those of you who are out there yelling about your Bergdorferi and your Dart Bergdorferi, you say that right. I'm usually the English guy. Of course, that's not really English.
That's more the science.
And
what I have done.
And the black dark field microscopy and all that. We get that. But if you have some questions on that, we have a presentation online. You can just go to powerhealthtalk.com, scroll down to our Lyme presentation, and it'll explain a lot more about that. We're not like,
we're not anti
that stuff, but we put it in perspective. We have a lot of people coming here with Lyme. They didn't come in here. They're starting to come in here for Lyme now, but they didn't come in here for Lyme. They came in here and I'm gonna just throw out some numbers here. They might be slightly off, okay? But of our first 10 or 12 or 15 patients, like most of them got better. Like all of them kind of did much better except one I can think of. Mm-hmm. And so we started looking at each other and going, this is a bad immune system, and this is a lot of stress.
Right.
This is a stress mechanism, and this is a bad immune system. So that's why that kind of comes up in this. So for your Lyme patients, go look at our other thing. It's an hour long. We don't have enough time to get off into that. And so with chronic fatigue.
And the reason why, exactly. The reason why Lyme has implications on chronic fatigue, as does things like Epstein-Barr virus and other intracellular infections and chronic co-infections like chlamydia, not the sexually transmitted kind, but a different form of it, is that these bacteria, pseudobacteria, these viruses, some of them can have the tendency to basically use our energy producing systems in our cells of our body, where the DNA is. These energy producing systems are called the mitochondria. Well, these basically subclinical infections or pathological infections can use our mitochondria to replicate themselves. So that way they make more of them. But in the process of doing that, our mitochondria tends to break down and it can't make as much energy anymore. So that can be a piece of chronic fatigue for sure. And we've seen definitely with eradication of those organisms with repair mechanisms for the mitochondria that some chronic fatigue patients will definitely improve, or that may be a necessary piece of the puzzle. Again, we've been through thyroid at length, but then after all of that, then yes, the adrenals definitely tie in with these blunted cortisol responses. And it's one piece of the puzzle that has to be acknowledged. But again, we tie this in and I attached the references so you could see the articles showing that yes, cortisol, the adrenal stress hormone, is off in chronic fatigue patients, and it needs to be looked at. So
okay. So treatment?
Oh, and childhood abuse, one last thing. So they basically have shown those kids who have been through childhood abuse, independent of whether you have fibromyalgia or independent if you have chronic fatigue. If they look at these adolescents who have been through physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, in essence, they have abnormal stress responses. They've seen that they, over time, produce way too much cortisol. So they'll take a little hair samples and they'll see a lot of cortisol in their hair. But then when they're under like immediate stress, they actually won't make as much stress hormones as they should necessarily, but then lots of times their stress response may be kind of delayed, and then they'll have an amplified increased stress response for a certain length of time after that, where they just can't unwind from that stressor. So that's the element of that post-traumatic stress disorder that we've been through time and time again in these broadcasts. And we even did a broadcast on anxiety and depression.
And that's a study that reflects what we do see in practice every day. There are other things, as Dr. Gates said, you can be physically abused, verbally abused, sexually abused. Talked to a patient yesterday who she left home at 15. And so clearly there were some stressful circumstances there. And then she kind of cognited on this kind of when these things started to happen. She had an autoimmune history. The stress was a trigger for her autoimmune condition. And then that's how she ended up here. And the point I wanted to make off of that is another triggers, stress triggers. I use this example, and I don't even know. I don't even know if I use this example, but it seems to be an emotional issue that sets off the post-traumatic stress syndrome. Certainly fear is an emotional issue, but I kind of equate, like when you go to the movies, if you go to the movies and you're watching an emotional movie, even a love movie, and and your heart's starting to pound, or you go to a scary movie and it's like, you're going like, oh, what's creating that effect is the music in the movie that's affecting your emotional system, and then that emotional system somehow engages, and then this is a survival mechanism. The stress mechanism gets set off. It's a survival mechanism. And then that seems to be the type of thing that perpetuates it. Now, I'm not the neurological guy. He may just tell me right now why that happens, or if that's correct.
Why the music perpetuates it?
Yeah. Or why the emotional, it seems to be an emotional stress.
And are you saying this in reference to people like who've been through abuse, or just the general public?
Just the person who comes in here and this stress mechanism is engaged, it almost seems to always be an emotional trigger if it's a stress.
For sure. I mean, I would say especially the patients we've treated, I mean, the amount of...
I walked into a room, my husband was there, I thought he was dead.
Right.
This whole thing went off. I found out he wasn't dead, but I've still been stressed ever since.
And that's the hard part with post-traumatic stress disorder, which can range from, the military veteran who comes back from the Middle East and they've just seen atrocities beyond atrocities that really the human being is not made to deal with, versus, the wife who comes home, she's got the guy she loves most in the world and she sees him on the floor, not breathing. That's going to be pretty traumatic. And then there's also, the abuse phenomena that we've been through. So once someone has been through such a stressful, horrific circumstance like that, their brain literally changes, and especially their fear circuits in their brain tend to become plastic. That's how we term it. And so the fear becomes learned. So there becomes stronger and stronger connections from the fear center up through higher areas in the brain. And then the frontal lobes have a harder and harder time. The front part of the frontal lobe, if you want to say it that way, we be more specific, has a harder time shutting off the fear-based response. So then as that person goes through life, anytime they're kind of subjected to even minimal, what would seemingly, innocuous circumstances, like going and watching a UFC fight, or they're watching a movie and all of a sudden the music changes, and, somebody gets hit by a club or something, that can push them back into that stress response where they can't get out of it. Or maybe you're running late to work and all of a sudden now the rest of your day is going to be programmed for that stress response, because that's what your body has learned. And it's really hard to unprogram that response. And that's where, in terms of treatment modalities, we start with the brain first. We've made a concerted effort to not only acknowledge this, but to really assess this response in our chronic disease patients. We look at the frontal lobes heavily in terms of getting the frontal lobes to function better, to shut off these fear-based circuits. We do use natural supplements. If the natural supplements and our brain-based exercises are not working, brain-based is neuroplasticity-based exercise. If those aren't working, then we refer a patient for a medication. We refer several of our patients to a psychiatrist that we commonly work with.
Functional psychiatrist.
That's true. He's very well respected too within the standard psychiatric world too. He teaches at the university, is on the American Psychiatric Board, American Psychiatric Association. So refer to him. We also refer to a hypnotherapist who we've gotten wonderful results with. We refer patients who aren't into hypnotherapy to Christian counselors if that's their belief system. Bottom line is this has to be addressed. And until this is addressed, you as a patient are likely not going to get better.
And the big takeaway that I wanted to be able to communicate from that was when Dr. Gates said your frontal lobes aren't able to shut it down anymore. Your brain has learned it. The big point I try to make to a person when they come in here is they're not stressed. Frequently, more often than not, it's a woman with her husband sitting there when I'm doing the consult. And the husband's like, she's just got to let this thing not bother her, or she's just got to pull up her bootstraps. And frequently I'll ask, does this feel like you, to the patient? And the patient will say, no, it doesn't feel like me, because it's not you. It's the fact that your brain has learned this response. It's not that you can't handle stress. Okay. It's not that you are a stressed human being. And there are stressed human beings, but this is still the mechanism. It's that there is a mechanism in your brain that is expressing itself in your upper brainstem that has now, or the brain has learned it, and other parts of the brain that are supposed to shut it down aren't able to do so. And now here you are. And then that is affecting your adrenal glands, and then your adrenal glands are affecting your immune system and your left midbrain, and you're getting short-term memory loss, and you can't remember your words, and it's affecting your blood sugar and your electrolytes. And I mean, we're not going to go into all that because we could do this for hours, but that's how complex the stress response is. And if you have that going 24 hours a day, well, if you're watching this and you have it going, you know what it does to you. So let's talk. So the main takeaway there is, I'm not trying to be nice. It's not you, it's this mechanism. And that mechanism is not easy. It's probably the most difficult mechanism in the body, in my opinion, to shut down. And this is why we've spent so much time, Dr. Gates has spent so much time developing protocols here, and then ultimately creating alliances in every way, shape, or form possible to try to get the stress response down and dampen down and under control without drugs if possible. Okay, and most of the time that is possible, and sometimes it's not. So, but you don't get that stress response down, I'm gonna tell you something, nothing else is gonna get you better for any length of time. No getting your small intestinal bacterial overgrowth better by doing berberine, or by doing the FODMAP diet, or by doing fecal implants or anything like that. The point is that's how significant this adrenal fatigue and the stress mechanism that's causing. That's one of the things that's causing it is. Now, treatment modalities. So I would like you to include in this the adrenal stress index, because a lot of people are aware of it now, and it seems like a lot of people, my opinion, don't know how to interpret it. And I'm talking about doctors now. Okay, because I have to deal with this in there. I have to politely say no offense, but there's a lot of data that can come off of that if you study a little bit more as to how to interpret that data.
Right.
Is that polite?
That's very polite.
Okay.
That's very polite. Yeah. So we run the adrenal stress index. It's a salivary cortisol test. And this is just a hilarious area of debate, because most medical endocrinologists just totally do not believe in salivary hormone testing. And it is so well referenced and researched that it's just, I don't know, it causes vertigo to really try and figure out why it's not accepted. And I was being facetious there. So because I say that in all these research articles, when they're talking about stress from major scientific journals, they're talking about salivary hormone testing. They're using salivary cortisol testing as the primary medium for testing cortisol, because you can get a free cortisol reading. So cortisol that's not attached to anything else, free cortisol in your saliva. It's an accurate measure of what's going on in your circulation. You actually can test other adrenal hormones in the saliva as well.
If they do blood tests on it, it's attached to something. They can't. So the cortisol is actually attached to something. You can't assess it as well. But when you do it with the saliva, it's just a pure cortisol that's running around your brain and your body, and so it's way more accurate.
And it's way more feasible too, because you can send someone home with a kit and they can do 4 cortisol samples throughout the day. Whereas if you want to do this via blood testing, you got to go back to the lab every 4 hours. I mean, who has time to do that, especially at midnight when you're supposed to do the last test, or between 10 and midnight. So salivary cortisol testing is something that we utilize. And on the adrenal stress index, we're able to get what's termed a circadian rhythm. So what is the profile of the hormones throughout the day? And frequently you can have either just too much cortisol all day long. You may have too much cortisol in the morning.
Dr. Gates went like this, because it should be higher in the morning and then it should gradually go down as the day goes on.
For all of our podcast viewers, I'm sorry. So email our front desk and we can send you an example of a adrenal stress index, but or go online and just look it up. That's probably the best thing. So with that, cortisol is high in the morning, low in the evening. So some patients just have high cortisol all day long. Some patients have high cortisol in the morning and then normal cortisol during the day. Some have low cortisol in the morning. Exactly. Throughout the day, that's most fibromyalgia patients in the literature. Some of you have low cortisol in the morning and high cortisol at night. Also, some of the fibromyalgia patients demonstrate that. And the blunted cortisol response is just kind of low as the chronic fatigue population generally. So you have to know how to treat all of those disparate cortisol profiles.
You need to get it to look like this.
In addition to, you need to be able to understand the rest of the adrenal stress index in terms of what it means. Also on that test is DHEA, which is another adrenal hormone.
A lot of people just run that front page.
Right,
that
which
just
doesn't tell the story.
graph.
Because you have to run the DHEA, because adrenals make more than just cortisol. They make DHEA. You have to run 7-hydroxyprogesterone, because adrenals make progesterone. You also have to keep in mind that the adrenals affect potassium and sodium levels through the production of aldosterone. So it gets complicated. But with all that, if you can take that information and then tie it in with someone's clinical picture, so to speak, with everything else going on in their life, you can create a plan in addition to what we outline. So of course we start with the brain, we start with the psychology. We don't deal with psychology, but we refer for that when necessary. Excuse me. And then from there, you can start to see, are things correcting? And if they're not correcting, then you can enact strategies with supplementation to potentially rehabilitate the adrenal glands. There are many different rehabbing agents for the adrenals. Every supplement company has their own. Some include basically adrenal glandulars from cows or pigs or sheep. Others don't include those, and they include just these things called adaptogens, which basically are herbs that help the adrenals to function better. A lot of those were discovered in the Soviet Union to help their athletes with the stress of training. And sometimes patients need more reserves in their adrenal glands. So all hormones from the adrenal glands are made from pregnenolone. And pregnenolone, which is a big word, but pregnenolone is the gas in the tank. And when you don't have pregnenolone, you can't make enough cortisol. And for some of you females out there who are fatigued, and you also have the symptoms of abnormal menstrual cycle lengths, and you may have some facial hair, you may have polycystic ovarian syndrome originating, which is where you may get cysts on your ovaries, you may not, but you may be making too much DHEA from your adrenal glands, stealing the pregnenolone into DHEA, and you don't have enough cortisol because of that. Other times, for the guy out there who is 35 and he's working 80 hours a week and he's tired and he has no libido and he can't go exercise because then he's even more tired, you may have what's termed the pregnenolone steal, where you're putting all of your reserves into cortisol and you have nothing left for DHEA. And DHEA is a very important sex hormone, is associated with libido, associated with, you know, regular cognition and feeling good about yourself. So it's a complicated issue.
It is.
I could keep going and going, but I don't want to belabor
and
the
you
point.
are. Adrenal fatigue, if you have adrenal fatigue and you have any of the female symptomology that Dr. Gates just mentioned, you have too heavy bleeding, too light bleeding, intermittent bleeding, periods of 25 days, 18 days, 32 days, 10 days, etc. I don't even think that you consider, if you understood the whole spectrum of what creates that type of situation, you wouldn't even consider hormone replacement therapy until you got your adrenal fatigue under control, because all of the precursors that make those hormones are made in the adrenal glands. And as a result, we don't even, if somebody comes in for that, you treat everything else we talked about, the adrenal glands get better, and a substantial portion of the time, those symptoms will clear up without any type of hormone replacement therapy whatsoever. Sometimes the organs have been taxed for a long time, and sometimes you'll need nutritional support, or sometimes you'll need hormonal replacement support, but not that often, you know, if you handle it this way. So treatment modalities. A lot of people are coming in with these adrenal stress indexes. That's why I mentioned they come in with maybe the first page. They don't and where's the stress coming from? So what Dr. Gates was saying, to put it in like a clinical pearl, you can't just even do an adrenal stress index and completely know what's going on. You have to have a blood panel that tells you about the sodium and the potassium and so on and so forth. You have to know all this to get a complete picture, because where is the stress coming from that's hitting the adrenal glands, and which of the many chemicals, the corticosteroids, et cetera, in the adrenal glands are being affected. So if you happen to be lucky enough to take an adrenal stimulant and you feel better for a while, then that's good. But usually that's going to stop working because you haven't addressed the actual cause of what's causing your adrenal glands to fatigue. And as I have said, with a percentage of exceptions, once you start getting the stress off the adrenal glands, they tend to start working again. So just know that that's entirely possible. And so how do you do that?
Pretty much by outlining
modality.
Exactly. I think I kind of outlined that too. I feel comfortable with, basically every patient's different.
Just summarize.
Okay, sorry.
Because it was kind of spread throughout.
Okay. So to summarize, you have to first look at the person's history of stress. What happened? Does that person need frontal lobe exercises to modulate the stress? Do they need other strategies to calm down the stress? Breathing exercises, certain colored glasses we have found to be successful. Maybe they need a supplementation approach to calm down the fear-based responses in their brain. Others may need referral to a psychiatrist, psychologist, hypnotherapist, church counselor, whatever, but that needs to be addressed.
And we're all over like yoga and meditation, and all that, but for the most part, if your brain's going about 1,000,000 miles an hour, it's kind of hard to meditate. Right. And if your brain's going 1,000,000 miles an hour, yoga, do them. I'm not saying don't do them. I'm just saying usually by the time the patient gets here, that isn't going to work. And but once you get better, those are very, very effective in maintaining and modulating your stress hormone. But these are kind of, in a chronic world, which is where we live, these are the closest thing we get to kind of an acute situation where we'll bring other people into, because this stress mechanism, I'm telling you right now, it's got to go. I mean, if I'm sitting there and I'm doing a consult and it looks like there's no chance of us overcoming this person's post-traumatic stress syndrome. I mean, you can't imagine some of the things we've heard and hear people seeing people get killed. And I mean, I'm not talking people who are in the war. We've had people in here in the Gulf War. I mean, my dad fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and now it explains a lot of the things that he went through in his lifetime. I mean, you talk about a guy who was under post-traumatic stress syndrome. Oh my God. So this is a major. I mean, it really even was like 3 years ago that we really got it. Was it 4 years ago? I mean, when I say got it, yeah, we just looked at each other and said, look, we got to put together a whole paradigm to knock this thing out. We have a stress modification program that includes all of the things that Dr. Gates said based on that specific patient. Not everybody gets all of those things. And for the really stressed out people, we have a whole room here in our clinic dedicated to knocking down that stress mechanism so that the cortisol levels go down while we're treating them, so that the other things that we're doing are effective. And then as the cortisol levels go down and as the other parts of the body get better, then the adrenals start working, and then eventually they don't need to be in a stress room for the rest of their life. But it's just, when we got that was a key, our results got better.
Oh yeah.
A lot.
Infinitely better.
Yeah. When I say better, I mean, we got better long-term results. People got better quicker. I mean, there was a time we used to treat like a fibromyalgia case for 1.5 to 2 years. Now it's like maybe 4.5 to 6 months for the most part, with some exceptions. And
so once all those pieces of the puzzle are addressed, then we do look at supplementation procedures. Sometimes patients need medications. Just want to emphasize that. But in terms of supplementation procedures, we basically modify our supplementation procedures on what is going on with the adrenal stress index, and also what the patient's clinical profile is, and in conjunction with the fact that we probably have addressed all those other things, from the thyroid to the gut to mitochondrial dysfunction and chronic infections already by that point. So then we can start to hit the adrenals in a more precise fashion, and really by doing one thing at a time in a systematic manner, we're able to discern what the effective adrenal supplements are, and then basically keep the person on them for a certain length of time so that their adrenals can rehabilitate. Sometimes patients do need an adrenal medication too. We have referred patients for that to other alternative practitioners, where they'll give them a medication that's basically cortisol that will sustain their adrenals so that their adrenals can then heal, so their adrenals don't have to make cortisol, because the adrenals are not like a muscle generally. When you stimulate a muscle, it tends to get stronger. When you stimulate the adrenals long-term, they tend to get weaker. So with all these approaches, we're trying to basically fortify the adrenals, get them stronger, calm down the brain's hammering of the adrenal glands. And with doing that, we've seen some very, very successful results for the quote unquote adrenal fatigue patient. And we will assert it here first, adrenal fatigue is real. It needs to be a medical entity. It needs to be a diagnosis code. Whether or not that happens or not, that's out of my our control. But just know that it is a piece of the puzzle for the chronic disease, the chronic pain, the chronic fatigue patient. And make sure you have somebody who knows what they're doing when they're assessing your adrenal glands and how they're going to get you better.
And a key takeaway from his last explanation, which is huge, not unlike the thyroid, particularly Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which most of you have if you have a thyroid problem. You cannot even begin to know how to dose that or address the adrenals with medications or drugs until you have done what just Dr. Gates just said, which is calm down all of the infections, all of the things that are causing your adrenals to be under stress in the first place. Then you can know how to address them with herbs and botanicals and things of that nature. So I think it covers it.
I think so.
I think it covers it. That's what we know about adrenal glands. If you know anything more about it than we know, feel free to let us know. But we think at this point, based on our experience of patients' response to care and the research that's out there, which Dr. Gates is up on usually, like he'll review it up until right before we do these presentations. We do talks right until we do talks. So based on what's known out there, we think this is about as comprehensive a presentation as you're going to see. You can fill in the blanks for yourself relative to the different aspects of the topic. So that's it for this week. And again, thanks for tuning in. Apparently we're continuing to get more and more interested viewers. Feel free to send us topics. We can no longer take questions like we used to take them, because they just take hours to respond to, and we just don't have that time anymore. We're getting a lot thicker histories, a lot thicker binders with people who've been here and there and that, and we need the time to look at that and to evaluate our cases before we see them and things of that nature. So it's just becoming difficult. There's only so many hours in the day, but suggestions on topics we'll be happy to take. If some people ask, how do you guys, I had one came in last night from San Francisco, which was like 4 hours from here. And they said, you never say that you take patients on there. And we just kind of figured that people assume that. So yeah, of course we take patients, but there's stuff on our, there's information on our website as to how that happens. And we just assume people look at that. So this is not a sales pitch. We're here to educate. We feel that that's really what's most important. That's what we're seeing the need is right now, because there's so many disparate pieces out there that people are researching online, are just trying to bring the whole thing together for people so that they can have a little bit more understanding of the data that they're looking at, and maybe know that there may be a way out for them, as opposed to a lot of the patients coming in here. There's just this vast sigh of relief. The gal last night, this vast sigh of relief of like, oh my goodness, you mean I can actually improve? And then this lady happened to have a case that could probably be substantially better. So that's all we're trying to do here. If it's something that we do that you're interested in, you're welcome to look on our website. And we go through a pretty stringent patient selection process. So not everybody gets to be a patient, unfortunately. And but feel free to access that if you want to. So okay, so we'll hopefully come up with another exciting topic next week. And maybe he'll use one of mine. I don't know. Maybe it's been 1.5 years since I gave him the topic. So.
It has been 1.5 years.
So maybe we'll go one of mine next week. So, okay. Take care.
All right. Thanks for watching.